So let's talk about starting a force of the Emperor's own Golden Boys in Warhammer 40K. Some ideas for getting the Adeptus Custodes army off the ground. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing another entry for our Start Collecting Each Army series. We've talked about really quite a lot of the factions in 40k so far, but now I thought we'd do one on the Adeptus Custodes, arguably the most elite army in all of Warhammer 40k. In the video we'll talk a little bit about why you might want to collect a Custodes army, some of the advantages and disadvantages, then talk about planning an army, the first steps for getting a collection together, touch upon their upcoming combat patrol box and buying miniatures in 40k, and then move on to assembling some kits, expanding the army, and one example Custodes army list. As usual, a whole ton to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up, there's a lot of good reasons to collect the Adeptus Custodes, both from a lore, miniature, and gameplay point of view, but I think honestly one of the things that draws people to Custodes a bit more than other armies is that they're just a really easy faction to access and jump into the game with. As each soldier is kind of a demigod among mortals, you don't really need all that many of them to field a decent sized Custodes army. It means that they're one of the cheapest factions to get into 40k with, and you only need to paint up a relatively small amount of miniatures to field an entire 2000 point army. What's more, with relatively straightforward gameplay, and what miniatures they do have being relatively nice recent plastic sculpts, they're really quite a tempting army for people who are looking at getting into 40k for the first time. Definitely a really solid option if you are looking to jump into 40k. In any case, lore-wise, the Adeptus Custodes are basically the Emperor's own Space Marine Legion, genetically augmented superhumans, but technically not really counted amongst the Space Marines, as they are as far superior to a standard Space Marine as a standard Space Marine is to a normal human. Every single Custodian Guard is essentially the equivalent of another faction's hero choice, a fabled warrior with incredible martial prowess, intelligent and brave beyond most others in the entire Imperium, and bearing the very finest arms and armour that the Imperium can supply. Typically and historically, the Custodes have been the guardians of Holy Terror itself and the Emperor, rarely leaving the throne world in much of the last 10 millennia, but more recently, in the Indomitus era, small strike forces have been dispatched to many areas across the galaxy, leading by example, and taking the fight preemptively to the fiercest of the Imperium's foes. When they make war, their emphasis is typically on small strike forces of elite infantry bikes and dreadnoughts, always outnumbered, but indomitably walking straight through the fiercest of enemy fire to dispatch the foe with their blazing power weapons and guardian spears. Miniatures wise, the Custodes are in a slightly unusual place for Games Workshop armies. For the majority of their miniature line, there's arguably 3 or 4 main plastic kits. For the core Custodes, there's the Custodian Guard, their Alarus Terminators and Virtus Praetors, and the Sisters of Silence if you're fielding some of them as well. All really quite detailed and good quality plastic kits with some very detailed and ornate armour. The amount of choices that they have from Games Workshop though is slightly limited compared with a lot of other factions. They can certainly work very well with just the codex options, but there's a lot of interesting units that are made by Forge World and produced in resin, including some other fancier squads, different alternative dreadnoughts, and some decent ranged fire support tanks which are kind of entirely lacking within the main codex. In general though, if I were playing Custodes, I'd start with the Games Workshop things and maybe work up to some more fancy Forge World toys later in the collection. Gameplay wise, the Custodes are a very small elite army with really powerful war gear. Renowned for being enormously tough, they have toughness 5, 2+ saves, and 4+ invuls pretty much across the board, only a small amount of shooting and no psychic, and dealing most of their damage with massive general purpose melee. You can get a bit of fire support with high quality shots from things like the bikes, Forge World tanks, or some dreadnoughts, but typically their gameplay is going to be solidly slogging towards the central objectives, laughing off enemy firepower, and murdering anything that gets too close with mighty blows from power weapons. In particular, Custodes do fighty characters really well. Some of their shield captain builds can be ridiculously scary, as can Mr. Trajan Valoris. At time of recording for their in-game strength, they are arguably one of the strongest factions in all of 40k, quite forgiving for newer players, though with Games Workshop changing games balance quite so regularly, I think it's kind of inevitable that there are going to be some balance changes for them in the future. I'd always bear that in mind, and not just buy an army just literally for the game rules. Finally, price-wise, they are one of the cheapest and easiest factions to get into 40k with. Boxes of Custodian Guard or Jet Bike can net you a whole load of points on the table, compared with a lot of other more hoardy factions or ones with very light infantry. You're going to wind up paying a lot less unless you really dip very heavy into the Forge World toys. So if you are deciding to go for Adeptus Custodes, first up you can think about planning an army. Generally, I'd advise picking up the codex fairly early on. That really helps you get a grasp of what they can do and a bit of lore and background. Or alternatively, you could experiment with lists, say on Warhapedia, Battlescribe, or the 40K app. Look at some cool combos and what you might want to put together as an idea for a force. You can always test out and experiment with things like Tabletop Simulator, or running things like proxied models in test games to see whether or not you like the way that the army feels and plays on the table before you commit to painting up a whole load of gold. There's plenty of good stuff out there on the internet to guide Custodes players. If you want to get a bit more advice for actual Custodes players at the moment, look for their groups on Facebook, Reddit, Discord, and others. And there's plenty of good stuff elsewhere on the internet, both on and off YouTube. I have made a few Custodes videos, including a which shield host to pick, a couple of army list videos, and a tier ranking video. There's plenty of people playing battle reports on YouTube as well. Or you could look at other non-YouTube content creators, things like Goonhammer maybe. In any case, there's plenty of opportunities for getting to grips with the Custodes. Maybe some of the first initial choices that you could decide will be what sort of list that you're looking to build towards eventually. Whether or not you just want to build up a fairly balanced force with a lot of options, or really go for some sort of slanted army, perhaps run something that's just very heavy on infantry and loads of custodian guard, or go big on Virtus Praetor bikes, or maybe even field a big wing of Forge World Dreadnoughts. I'd also think a little bit about a colour scheme and how you're going to apply it to the Custodes. Most classically, they're generally going to be painted gold. That can be achieved really easily for newer painters. Just literally spray the models with a gold spray, give them a nice wash with a brown wash, and then you're good to go for the vast majority of the model, and then just add in a bunch of fine details after that, and you've got an army together very, very quickly. There's plenty of other techniques on YouTube though for painting gold. Very jazzy things that you can do either with airbrushes, dry brushes, or object source lighting techniques. You could definitely just have a search around and try and find a technique that you like if you do want your army to stand out a bit from the crowd. If gold isn't really your thing though, you don't really have to paint them that. Various different shield hosts have different quirks on the colour scheme. For example, the Solar Watch Custodian that goes to war mainly in white. You can always make up your own shield host colours if you want. There's nothing to stop you painting up a couple of test models and trying to select a different colour scheme if you think there's something else that would look really good. Putting plans into action then, let's talk about a few first steps for getting Custodes together. As I mentioned, the Adeptus Custodes Codex will be an early pickup for me. It came out in January of 2022, so at least at time of recording, it's fairly unlikely to go out of date anytime soon, although I will be aware that points costs have changed in the recent chapter approved since then. A day one points update that basically meant a lot of the units got a lot better. You can pick up a chapter approved if you want to, though there's other places that you can find those reduced points costs, things like Warhapedia, Battlescribe, or the 40K app. In general though, for models first steps, I'd think about some Custodian Guards and any other units that you find fun. The Custodian Guard box basically is a really good intro to them. You get 5 incredibly elite models for a really quite low cost comparatively. I think you're generally going to want at least some Custodian Guard to fill out the troops for your army, and it is also the box that you can use for fielding HQ models or Vexillas. So one box of this if you build one as a Custodes Shield Captain, one as a Vexilla, and then 3 as Custodian Guard. You've basically got yourself an entire little detachment of Custodes just from one box, the same cost as other factions' troops. Besides that, I certainly wouldn't hold back on anything else that you think is particularly inspiring or interesting for the faction. If the Terminators or the bikes are what attract you to them, or some of the flashy Forge World models, getting those together early could be some good inspiration to carrying on. The other consideration is the Combat Patrol Adeptus Custodes box, though at least at time of recording that's a bit of a waiting game as we're not 100% sure when it's going to be released. Basically this Custodes Combat Patrol box is a discount box for getting really quite a lot of the Custodes plastic in one kit. It'll cost £90, €120 or $150, but currently as of time of recording it isn't actually released yet, though Games Workshop has teased it and it should hopefully materialise sometime in the next few months. Could be very soon, could be a bit of a wait. In the box you get 1 squad of the Custodian Guard, which as we mentioned can build the Vexillas or the Shield Captain, 3 of the very scary Virtus Praetor bikes, and then 10 Sisters of Silence, the other half of the Talons of the Emperor, and can either do some grunt work holding down objectives and potentially be a very big impediment to enemy psychers. When it's out, the Combat Patrol box will be around about a 35% discount on buying all these kits separately, and depending on how you equip each of the models, you could easily have a 700 points plus of models here, a really good deal for 40k. There aren't all that many Combat Patrol boxes that give you quite so many points on the table, and particularly not ones that feature so many relatively recent plastic kits. I do quite like the way that you get basically 3 out of the 4 main plastic kits for the faction in this. I'm sure it will be popular once it comes out, though I don't think it's the sort of box that you'd want to purchase 3 times over. I just feel it's maybe a little bit heavy on the Sisters of Silence within the box. Kind of depends on how heavy you want to go on them in your army list, but I sort of feel by the time you've got 2 boxes of this, you might have more of them than you really need, so perhaps multiple copies of the box diminishes in value a bit, unless you either want all of those sisters, or you've got somewhere that you could either swap them or resell them. In any case though, once this releases, I certainly feel like a box of this could be one of the best ways to get into Custodes. This one backed up with either some more bikes, Terminators, or Standard Guard, and you've got a really good going entry to the faction. Just in general, as a quick note for buying 40k miniatures, I would bear in mind that there's a few different ways in which you can do so. Directly buying from Games Workshop is fine, but generally if you are looking to economise, that is going to be the most expensive way of doing things. Depending on where you are around the world, there's often local gaming stores either in your area that might offer a discount, or ones that you can order from online to get some discount on Warhammer models. Within the UK, there is the channel's affiliate link sponsor. Element Games generally gives 10 to 20% off Games Workshop's miniatures, and there's a link to them down in the video description. If you are looking to pick up some Custodes models, then that could be a cheaper way to do so if you do live in the UK. The link also supports the channel as well. A small amount goes to Auspex Tactics without costing you any more when you buy, so it could be a good way to help support the channel and also get a few miniatures at a discount if you want. If you're not in the UK though, I'd recommend giving it a Google search. There's quite a lot of discounters in quite a few countries. Otherwise, you can consider even further sources, second-hand markets like eBay, if the modelling isn't at quite as big a deal to you, or you'd rather just save a bit of money and get some pre-assembled models, then that could be a good way to save a fair bit of time, money and effort. Obviously the quality and what's actually available might be a bit variable though. And also in the age of 3D printing, there's often quite a lot of great alternative sculpts for most 40k armies. A lot of people make designs that are sort of quite like Adeptus Custodes, though not quite exactly the same, and it can be a potentially handy choice for getting hard to get figures. It's often quite a popular option for getting things to resemble some of the more fancy Forge World things that they often struggle to keep in stock, or are just very expensive for how much resin you get. Once you have actually got some models in hand though, perhaps one of the first decisions is how to assemble a Custodian Guard kit. In general, for the Troops choice slot, you can either give them either the Guardian Spears or the Presidium Shields and Sentinel Blades, and I feel like compared with previously, both options are pretty viable at the moment. The shields will make you a bit tougher, particularly if you can get light cover, but they do cost a bit more, and the Guardian Spears are a little bit more threatening at range and melee. I think with the first Custodian Guard kit, I will be quite tempted to build one up as a Vexilla and a regular shield captain. It's basically getting the option of 2 different quite fun characters for the price of just a standard infantry model. You might not necessarily use them in every single game going forward, but it does seem like a really cheap way to add some fun flexibility to the army just out of one single standard troops kit. You're not even really locking yourself out of many options for the shield captain. You could just field him as a regular Custodian Guard in some games, and just say he's a bit of a fancy squad leader or something. From there, I'd build up to 500 points or 25 power level and get a few combat patrol style games in. With big units, Custodes might be a little bit weird to play in smaller games. You're not going to have all that many squads on the table, and that often is going to be the case all the way up to bigger games as well. Definitely an army that's quite easy to expand quite fast with. Following that, after getting a bunch of Custodian Guard and some characters together, I'd be thinking about adding more damage dealers to the list. I'd certainly be considering getting some Virtus Praetors fairly early, with those punishing salvo launchers and the massive damage on the charge. Perhaps with the second box of those, I'd be quite tempted to use one of those as a shield captain on Dawn Eagle Jetbike. It's a really efficient and brutal choice for the Custodes right now, with that tip of the spear shield captain upgrade. Trajan Valoris is also ridiculously strong, and it's also quite fun to have the faction's default commander on the board. I will be tempted to pick up a copy of him to run when you've got some slightly bigger games on the go. You can add in a fair amount of Sisters of Silence to the force. Typically the way that I'd use them would just be a few small supporting units, as opposed to trying to make them the main damage dealers, which I just don't think they do quite as well. Maybe 1 or 2 small squads of prosecutors with the bolt guns to fill out troop squads, do actions, and hold objectives for cheap. And then you could look into some Forge World options, in particular Sagittarium Guard, Venatari Custodians, and the Forge World Dreadnoughts are all really quite strong and powerful. I would bear in mind that these are resin kits though, perhaps a little bit less user friendly and a bit more intimidating to new collectors, though with a bit of decent internet research, I'm sure that most people would get by just fine. Finally, I thought we'd just round up with one example of a strong Custodes army list. This one I've already talked about on the channel once before, but it's by Ben Hampshire, who used it to take first at the Leodis Games February GT. A really good example of what makes Custodes strong at the moment. This one's a Emperor's Chosen battalion, a shield company that gives you the 4+ save against mortal wounds, a bit of extra damage rerolls, and also a nice flexible stratagem to allow you to acquire the fighting styles of other shield hosts. It's led by a trio of fighty characters, a shield captain with Terminator armor with that Praetorian plate, the very threatening relic that allows you to jump your captain forward to pummel some enemies in melee, and he's got impregnable mind as well for a bit of psychic denial. One shield captain on a Dawn Eagle jet bike with salvo launcher, that one's stacked with all sorts of upgrades, tip of the spear for some rerolls and auric exemplar for extra attacks, superior creation for a 5+ feel no pain, and the Castellan's mark to allow you to redeploy some units. Finally, there's Trajan Valoris, who's just all round strong, handing out some massive rerolls and melee damage. Then there's 4 different squads of Custodes, one unit of Custodian Guard with the Presidium Shields, a unit of Sisters of Silence Prosecutors, one unit of the 3 Forge World Sagittarium Custodians with the Bolt Casters, they're the more ranged version of Custodian Guard, and a unit of the Elite's Choice Wardens with Guardian Spears. They get the Feel No Pain type save and also grant the Bodyguard rule for characters. Then to do a bit of heavy lifting, there's 2 units of Virtus Praetors with the salvo launchers for some massive ranged firepower and melee threat, 2 of these very stylish looking Contemptor Achilles Dreadnoughts with the massive Guardian Spears, all round strong with some decent firepower and massive D3+3 melee damage, and a fast moving Caladius Grav tank with the Arachnus Heavy Blaze Cannon, some good anti-tank and anti-infantry firepower on the move. I feel like this one's currently got a lot of very good examples of what make Adeptus Custodes strong at the moment, though of course there's a lot of different ways that you can play them, going heavier on the bikes or dreadnoughts, going mass infantry, or trying out other shield companies such as say Solar Watch or the Shadow Keepers. So anyway, I hope that's provided a bit of inspiration for getting into the Adeptus Custodes. I look forward to hearing any of your thoughts down in the comments below. Are you going to be starting a shield host soon? Or are you a seasoned Custodes general who's got some tips and tricks for newer players? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep these 40k videos coming very regularly. I'm sure we'll have a fair bit more for the Adeptus Custodes in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention one way in which you can help support, and that's my Element Games affiliate link which I mentioned earlier, which is down in the video description. As I said, if you live in the UK, Element Games gives you a decent discount on Warhammer miniatures. If you click the link down in the video description and order through them, a small amount goes to help support the channel and doesn't cost you any more whatsoever. Can just be a way to help out if you were thinking about picking something up anyway. For people over in the USA, there is also an Amazon link down there as well. Again, that works in much the same way. Click the link, order anything whatsoever off Amazon, and a small amount goes to help support the channel at no extra cost to yourself. A big thank you to you guys who have been using those, it really does help out. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.